What if we had a second referendum? That's a second referendum with an option to remain. Well, the People's Vote campaign are debating a vote between three main options. Theresa May's deal, or a version of it that Parliament will come up with in the next week. No deal, that's leaving on World Trade Organization rules, or remaining in the EU completely, revoking Article 50 and keeping the current deal we already have with the European Union. So let's place those three options on a scale where the yellow represents remain and the blue represents leave. So let's just say the deal that Parliament comes up with will be somewhere in the middle. We don't know how far it's going to be towards leave or remain, but we're assuming that it's going to take account for both sides of the argument. That would mean a hard Brexit, no deal scenario would be fully on the leave side in the blue area, and remaining would be in the yellow area. Now we know from the 2016 referendum that 52% of people voted to leave the European Union, and 48% of people voted to remain in the European Union, putting the electorate roundabout here on that scale. Now, Theresa May's deal, voted on last week, was rejected by 432 MPs, and it was supported by 202 MPs. So using the idea that one MP represents 92,000 people, we can work out roughly how many people in the country support the deal, given they were democratically voted into Parliament in the 2017 election. Now I understand that not all constituents those MPs represent will necessarily support their MP in this vote, but let's just imagine that number of people who support the deal is spread out amongst the country, and we're being relatively optimistic here by using the 2017 election as a representation to people's Brexit opinions of their MPs. So, if 202 MPs supported the deal, that represents 18.5 million people, or 32% of the electorate, with 68% of MPs against the deal. So 432 MPs who rejected the deal represent 39.7 million people. Again, not all of their constituents will agree with them, so let's just imagine all these people are spread out across the country. Now, if the 39.7 million people these MPs represent around the country are against the deal, that means that if we split these 39.7 million people between 52% for leave and 48% for remain, that means that 20.6 million people support leaving and 19 million people support remaining. It's the same proportion as the 2016 referendum, but instead it's using all of the potential electorate. Now, let's just suppose that the deal is somewhere exactly in the middle. That would mean that the 18.5 million people who support the deal would get split directly in two, taking away 9.25 million people from both sides, leaving 11.4 million people who support leave, 9.8 million people who support remain, and 18.5 million people who support the deal. Or to put it another way, 30% of people would support no deal, 50% of people would support a deal, and 30% of people would support remain, or 60% of people would support an alternative to the deal. But what I hear you say if the country's moved further towards remain? Well, let's instead slash the support for the deal and instead give 75% of those people towards remain and 25% of those people towards leave. That would mean that 2.3 million people would be taking off the 19 million people who support remain, and 6.9 million people would be taking off the 20.6 million people who support leave, giving 13.7 million people who support no deal, 9.25 million people who support a deal, and 16.7 million people who support remain. Or, to put it another way, 23% of the electorate supports a deal, 35% of the electorate supports no deal, and 42% of the electorate supports remaining. In other words, 58% of the electorate would support an alternative to remaining, but remaining would get the majority. And if it was the other way round, if more people supported leave than remain, you'd end up with a similar situation where 23% of people would support a deal, 44% of people would support no deal, and 33% of people would support remain. Or in other words, 56% of people would support remaining or a deal compared to the majority who supported no deal. That's the problem with a three-way vote, and it clearly just divides the country further. But what about Norway and Canada Plus? There are other kinds of deal that have been offered. What if we have that instead of Theresa May's deal, for example? Well, Canada Plus would be further towards the leave side because it means leaving the customs union and single markets. Norway Plus would be further towards the remain side because it means accepting free movement of people and staying in the European Free Trade Area, which is a customs union. So let's just use the same rules as the first vote, where 30% of the electorate would support no deal, 50% of the electorate would support some kind of deal, and 30% of people would support remain. That would naturally split up the people who support a deal if all those options were available in a referendum. So only 16.6% of the electorate potentially would support either of those options, giving 60% of people who support the alternatives and 50% of people who support a deal. But what about just asking us whether we want to join the customs union, for example? Just keep it simple. Let's have a second referendum, but just keep it simple, you say. Well, Parliament has already voted on this. 52% of Parliament said no to a customs union, leaving 48% of Parliament saying yes to a customs union. And what about just joining the European Economic Area? That's the customs union and the single market. Again, Parliament has already voted on this. The Labour Party actually abstained from this vote. It was a Lord's amendment to the withdrawal bill. 72% of Parliament said no to a European Economic Area, leaving 28% of Parliament saying yes at the time. So it's very clear what Parliament doesn't want and what the electorate doesn't want. But it's not quite so clear what the electorate does want. But what do you want? Join in the debate below and subscribe.